Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Outside 2020, a sustainable landscape collaborative. Together we can increase the adoption of sustainable landscape practices and contribute to a healthy, vibrant, and sustainable future for all Floridians.
Oh yeah, because we got 30 seconds.
Please welcome to the stage our first two speakers who will share their perspectives on sustainable landscapes. Dr. Patrick Bohlen is Director of Landscape and Natural Resources and Arboretum and Professor of Botany at the University of Central Florida.
For real.
Good.
The Landscape and Natural Resources Department is responsible for landscape operations and natural resource management for UCF's main campus, Lake Nona Medical Campus, and other UCF facilities. Dr. Bohlen also oversees the UCF Arboretum, which provides opportunities for relevant experience-based learning, urban ecology research, and human connections with ecosystems and landscapes. Chris Hite, a professional landscape architect who leads Dix Hite Plus Partners, a Central Florida-based design firm she founded with fellow landscape architect Jeff Dix in 1996. Chris's design work celebrates the unique characteristics of a place's social and geographical context, with a special focus on local ecologies, cultural identity, history, native plants, local materials, urban form, regional character, and quality of life.
Hi, I'm Chris. Really happy to be here. It's an incredible honor to be kicking off this session and such an important conversation for the state of Florida and sustainable landscapes. We've been asked, Patrick Bohlen and I, to address some questions. One, how we define sustainable landscapes from the practitioner's perspective, because we both practice. Two, address some of Florida's challenges and obstacles as it relates to the adoption of sustainable landscapes at a sustainable scale. Three, some of the successes we've had, but I think you'll also see that we'll share some of the challenges. And then on closing, going through some of the follow-ups and how we might connect the dots and take this initiative to the next level. So from my perspective, so the title is called Sharing Perspectives because it's just talking about our practical experience and things that we've observed over the years. And you know, I've been practicing for a long time, have been blessed to practice in the state of Florida for my entire career, and that leads to, I hope, some wisdom and sharing some thoughts and ideas. So the first question, defining sustainable landscapes from the practitioner's perspective. So this is a pretty big question, and I define it pretty broadly from my perspective. It's not one aspect. It's not just water, it's not just soil, it's not just plants. It's much broader. It's the land. It's everything that we touch when we talk about community and land development, actually. At a real high level relative to landscapes, it's working to protect, improve, and regenerate ecosystems overall. It's how we touch the land as humans and everything that the landscape can do specifically to improve our health and well-being. It's trees, you know, shade, broadly regulating climate across the planet. It's plants providing, you know, a healthy, breathable atmosphere, again, holistically. It's the bugs and pollinators and everything that makes those ecosystems work. And it's the soils. So it's the whole transect of the landscape. And interestingly enough, you know, there's a lot of ways to benchmark landscape sustainably specifically. You know, folks have been working hard over the past 20 to 30 years to figure out how we can measure landscape sustainability. And there's things that the state of Florida can do to leverage some of these benchmarks. You know, a lot of us and folks that are listening in are probably familiar with low-impact development practices. That's a very holistic approach. You all might be familiar with the Site Sustainability Initiative. That's a completely holistic approach to sustainable land development and landscape. And then, of course, Florida Friendly. The state has been working really hard to educate and promote a Florida-friendly approach to landscape specifically. And we can benchmark, you know, all of this. And at the top, you know, I put this at the top, it's human health and well-being. Landscapes, healthy landscapes, how we interact with landscapes helps us as humans be healthier and calmer, especially in times like this when you know, we're all going through a lot in times of COVID. How landscapes regulate the climate. You know, like I mentioned before, cleaning the air, how landscapes can work to actually clean water holistically. That goes back a little bit to the low-impact development comment. Erosion, sediment control. Overall, again, holistic hazard mitigation, landscape resiliency. I mentioned pollination. Habitat can occur in your yard, or habitat can occur in natural areas. And sometimes it's so small in your yard that you might not even know what's happening. And of course, when we think about habitat holistically, it might be in those edges and natural conservation areas. Food. Landscape sustainability has to do with you know, food for habitat, but also food for humans. How all of that is managed and regulated, and then of course just generally the cultural benefits around landscapes, the touch points, and how the landscape is actually appropriate to your own community and your own place. Sustainable land design and development. When I, as a practitioner, think about landscape sustainability and that question, I think about it holistically. I think about it broadly. I think about it from the house and how we, you know, might deal with our home holistically in the landscape. But then I think about communities and systems. So if you can imagine a university, you know, and the management of that landscape, or a city and how they might manage their streetscapes and their parks and their natural areas holistically. When we talk about measuring that and how we benchmark it again, I go back to all of the things that are listed here: the context of the site and the appropriateness, the engagement to the landscape. Again, how the landscape is working for us relative to management and restoration, soil and vegetation, materials. Where are we getting our materials? How proximate are our materials? Are we getting them within a reasonable radius? For example, a 500-mile radius might be considered reasonable by some of these benchmarks. Human health and well-being, again. Construction methods, means and methods, how sustainable are those? Operations and maintenance. You know, we hand the baton over to operations and maintenance, and so often, you know, they run the, you know, I'll be driving down the street and there's a water-wise landscape that was installed and the irrigation's running every day. So how that baton is passed. And then education around our exterior environment and landscapes. And then lastly, how are we pushing the benchmarks around innovation? So that's another really great measure. So I spoke earlier about the overall scale of sustainable landscapes. Again, it's something that we need to think about holistically. I show this slide because it's just an example of an urban area, actually in Orlando, where each of these pieces and parts, as projects come together, they each have landscape components. And so as we, you know, might work on one project to the next, individually on the site, how we develop and manage is important, but then how it all comes together as a system is important. So the scale of sustainable landscapes is broad. We also like to talk about landscape sustainability, and I call it across the TRANSECT. Those of you that might be familiar with new urbanism kind of know that a new urbanist TRANSECT goes from a very, very urban environment, the streetscape, to, you know, a less urban, perhaps townhomes, to even less suburban, and then, you know, you have the one TRANSECT, and that's your conservation and rural areas. We like to apply this idea to our approach on any sort of project, from the home to the community to the city. And so as you think about how you're designing and considering your landscapes, you need to think about it broadly. There might be oasis zones where there's a lot of touch points, but then as you move towards the edges, things become more natural. So I talk about community landscapes, but this can also be applied on the homestead, okay? So again, it's a broad question. So even on your own house, you can have the full landscape transect. You can have the oasis zone, you know, maybe out by your patio, or you might have potted plants and color and you know, a lot of water requirements. You might have a cultivated garden that requires watering every day. But then, you know, you might have a little patch of sod for your dog, or not. But then as you move away from the house, you know, the landscape can actually become less, the water needs on the landscape can go down. And then additionally, even how you approach fertilization and all of that can be considered just on your home landscape. So again, the scale of landscape sustainability goes from a very small microcosm to the macro, to the community level. So the next question that we wanted to talk about was some of Florida's challenges and obstacles regarding the adoption of sustainable landscapes at a meaningful level and meaningful scale. It can be challenging, and sometimes we feel like we're, you know, beating our head against the wall to get these things done. But it's also again, a pretty incredible honor to be a practicing landscape architect and to be able to encourage clients and communities to take these steps. So the norm, you know, to this day, we're still developing like this, with, you know, lots of sod, no kind of holistic consideration of how the landscape might be managed. We're handing homeowners a key and an irrigation system and St. Augustine and a few shrubs, and then we're expecting that they're going to be able to manage and control that landscape. And then additionally, we're doing the same thing broadly. You know, as you drive down the street anywhere in Florida, you're going to see large-scale landscapes that are using a lot of resources that they shouldn't be. And if we consider this more strategically up front, we can actually work to completely change the norm. So that's the challenge here. But there are a lot of things in place that continue to foster this sort of development. As all of you have seen it, we see it everywhere. You know, you'll be walking your dog down the street and it's just rained, as it feels like it's been raining for the past 30 days straight here in Orlando. And there's the irrigation running, you know, and there's the runoff going directly into the drain. And you know that St. Augustine lawn that's there, and nothing against St. Augustine in certain aspects, and nothing against turf when it's used wisely. But you know, the pesticides and the fertilizers are going directly into our storm and drainage systems. And unfortunately, a lot of times in Orlando and across Florida, those storm systems are going directly into our lakes and water bodies. So how do we change this? How do we move the needle? So I wanted to walk through a few projects that we've worked on, and some of the successes we've had. But I don't want to answer the question just about successes. I also want to answer it in regards to some of the challenges that still remain. Because it seems like, you try to hit all the marks, all of the landscape sustainability marks that I mentioned previously, but it seems like we never get it all right. So I'll share a few projects and some things that we've been fortunate to work on. So Oviedo, the city of Oviedo is a pretty forward-thinking community, and we've had the honor to be working with them for, gosh, the past 15 years or so, maybe more. And their master plan back in the late 90s identified that they wanted a new village center. And so back in the late 90s, they identified that land where they thought that that village center could occur. And so what that would do for the city of Oviedo is it would create two nodes. It would create what's now called Oviedo on the Park, and then they would still have the Uptown Oviedo, or Old Town Oviedo, as some people refer to it. So the goal of Oviedo was to take a holistic approach to the land development of this site, and they wanted it to be walkable. They wanted it to be connected. They wanted it to hit a lot of the benchmarks that we talk about when we speak to landscape sustainability. And on the whole, I think they've achieved a lot of their goals. Now they have, at the end of the day, an overall actual landscape that needs to be managed, and that's managed in part by individual landowners, but then it's also managed by the city of Oviedo. So I'll walk you through this. This is kind of this slide shows kind of the evolution of the project over time. So projects like this start out with a master plan. This is a piece of the Oviedo master plan, and you can see that it's set up as a grid, a walkable grid. It has a central park, which the grid is the center and energy. It has an amphitheater, splash, play, retail, living units, and then as you get towards Mitchell Hammock Road in the bottom, for those of you that might be familiar with Oviedo, it becomes a little bit more what I call a transitional. There's a Starbucks. But it's hitting a lot of the marks. It's walkable, it's engaging, and the city has been able to program it in pretty neat ways. So overall, it's meeting a lot of those holistic approaches to sustainability that I mentioned. This is an aerial that kind of shows you, kind of takes the plan and kind of puts it in perspective and scale. You can see the pond in the distance there. So one thing that is pretty interesting is that we were able to apply Florida-friendly approaches to Oviedo on the Park. So that central core, the park space, tends to be a little bit more of the oasis zone. And the city has come in and, they love color, and that's where people are walking and touching. And so that's been relatively successful, but there's also been some challenges. For example, along the lake edge, as landscape architects, we originally planted this littoral zone. Well, the city has found that that's been a bit hard for them to maintain, and so they've cut that down, and that doesn't exist. Additionally, Oviedo on the Park was able to incorporate some levels of low-impact development, one of those being stormwater management. As water approaches Oviedo on the Park, or kind of flows through the system, it hits some LID swales before popping into the main stormwater system. The other aspect of Oviedo on the Park is that we were able to incorporate conservation. There's a big wetland strand to the north that remains, and we were able to pull some of those landscape elements, ecologically appropriate landscape elements, into Oviedo on the Park. But funny enough, the city still doesn't really love pines, pine trees. because of the constant pine fall and pine needle fall. So there's some management and operation concerns. For the landscape architect, that might be seen as a positive. For the city manager, that might be seen as a negative. So passing that baton can be challenging. Another project is Starkey Ranch. Originally a 30,000 acre ranch in Pasco County. 5,000 acres of that was set aside for development, and 2,500 acres of that were actually developed. It's a pretty good example of land development broadly, where you're combining conservation and implementation. And for that overall project, as the landscape architects, we took a very Florida-friendly and applied the landscape TRANSECT across the project. So we had some great successes, as you can see in this image. One of the challenges and difficulties was the home sites. They kind of defaulted to the standard that I spoke to earlier, and it's a predominance of ornamentals and sod. So some great successes, but not everywhere. We're also able to incorporate some low impact development techniques, and that's been pretty successful, as well as pretty sustainable approaches to parks and roadway networks using Bahia sod, native plant material, et cetera. We were able to conserve and preserve across the project, and we were able to do landscape moments where we actually engage the natural environment, and that's been pretty neat and fun. There's a lot of restored and regenerative wetlands across the site, and calling attention to those through education and moments was something that has been pretty successful out there. HAMLIN is one of the villages in Horizons West. This particular project also has a lot of the components we've talked about, and we've been successful on certain aspects of it. One key aspect that has been pretty incredible at HAMLIN is low impact development. HAMLIN soils are amazing. They soak up water like a sponge. So we've really truly been able to apply stormwater cleansing at HAMLIN. And that's been a kind of a mutual benefit to the residents and to the health, but also to the developer, because there's been a little bit more developable land. Even the Publix and the Walmart embraced some of these LID moves. That was kind of a huge thing. Dig Site was pretty happy about that. Again, some lessons learned, but pretty neat when the Walmart and the Publix embraces LID. And then even the application of wildflowers and natives across HAMLIN. Some successes, but also some lessons learned. You know, folks are like, what's that weedy spot over there? And, you know, the developer in some cases came in and removed some of those areas. And we came back with and answered with some education and signage, but still that passing of the baton sometimes is difficult. And then broadly, conservation at HAMLIN has been pretty successful, lakes and marshes. Now down to the homestead. So this is just 3 examples of homesteads that are completely relevant to their local ecology and actually use no water. There's no supplemental irrigation in each of these landscapes, and it's very contextually appropriate. So we find that on the application level, you can do it. So then, what are the goals for the outside collaborative? 1, let's establish a new norm. Let's look to some of the existing benchmarks out there, like the Site Sustainable Initiative, as a bar. And perhaps let's work to set a framework in the state of Florida for achieving some of those goals. But then let's also talk and connect the dots. My personal hope for this outside collaborative is that we get people talking. So this picture right here happened last week, and that's Patrick Bohlen right there with the mask on. And to his right is Drew Boulware with the City of Oviedo. Because the city was kind of challenged with some of the maintenance practices at the city across their broad landscape management, I was like, well, you know what? Patrick's managing a broad landscape at UCF. Let's get you guys talking, because Patrick's doing some cool things, and perhaps you can learn from each other. So that's what I'd personally like to see from the outside collaborative. I'm going to pass it over to Patrick now. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chris. That is an excellent talk, and I'm glad you touched upon so many of the themes that I'm going to cover as well, and maybe give a slightly different perspective. This visit that we had last week was really great. So, and I didn't have time to squeeze it into my talk, so I'm glad you did. I gave a talk in the spring. Virtual meeting that we had, presentations that we had that came through 1,000 Friends of Florida. And I'm going to take a slightly different tack this time, but I really want to thank the collaborative, and in particular I want to call out Tim Sallin for his organizational efforts on this. He's really been a thought leader, he's a practitioner, and I really think it's fantastic, because I think to move the marker forward like we want to, we're really going to have to do it through a collaborative process, and we're going to have to get all the different players involved in each of the different aspects of it involved. I kind of fell into this somewhat accidentally. I am an ecologist, biologist by training. When I came to UCF, I came as the Director of Landscape and Natural Resources, so I immediately took over a relatively large landscape operation. It would be like a small municipality, and got involved in things like landscape design and planning and stormwater and civil engineering and those kinds of things, and started to think about how I could apply my ecological knowledge to that, as well as running an arboretum program that has an educational and outreach component to that. So after doing 10 years of that, I've just kind of acquired a knowledge that enables me to speak, I think, somewhat knowledgeably, at least in this region, on sustainable landscapes and what we mean by that. And in the spring, I really talked about the ecological foundations. And this is kind of this talk kind of builds on that. Today I want to talk about biodiversity in particular as a theme in sustainable landscapes, in part because I think it's a really important metric. It's one that integrates a lot of different aspects, and it's really what we're all talking about when we talk about nature and connecting with the natural world. So I want to take a slightly different tack and use that as a centralized theme for this talk. One of the reasons I want to do that is because biodiversity is a global issue, biodiversity loss. I think if we're going to talk about sustainable landscape, we certainly need to be putting it within the context of our major global issues of the day, one of which is obviously climate change. But biodiversity loss is big too. There was a paper that came out a few years ago, within the past couple of years, claiming that the loss of biodiversity globally is as important a global issue as climate change, but maybe a little bit under the radar. And the other thing is those two issues are very much related. So climate change and loss of biodiversity relate to one another. Here we see in this slide sort of the culprits of the loss of biodiversity. Habitat loss in the upper left corner, you see the residential development, any kind of development, including agricultural development. We have nutrient loading on our waterways, which I think in Florida all of us are acutely aware of the issues there. We also have invasive species, and that's something when we talk about our natural lands and conservation lands and even our built landscapes, the invasive species can pose a real challenge to our ability to maintain sustainable landscapes. They really need to be addressed forcefully. And then the slide showing the picture showing the picture of the United States, that's pesticide use. That's one neonicotinoid pesticide use across the nation. And the use of pesticides still remains a major issue facing sustainability both in built residential urban landscapes as well as agricultural landscapes. And then climate change, obviously. With the change in climate, I think in many respects in Florida we're lucky where we are in terms of the experience of climate change. Obviously the coastal areas are most at risk, but when we're talking about sustainable landscapes, climate change comes into play when we talk about climate resilience and building for the future, because we are going to have a change in our climate in the coming decades. If we're going to take care of biodiversity, I think one of the reasons conservation suffers in some respects is because we don't place the kind of value we might on conservation. It has to be up against something like development and profitability. But I think in the US we've done a very good job globally, and really in the state of Florida we've preserved more than 25%, approaching 30% of the landscape in some kind of conservation land, which is the global goal for the UN Biodiversity Conference and the National Geographic 30 by 30 sort of goal. So we do a pretty good job. We're lucky to live in Florida, and we're lucky also to have the kind of people in the industry and working together on these issues. But back in 1997, Bob Costanza, who's kind of one of the founders of ecological economics, tried to put a dollar value on the ecosystem services, quote unquote, that we get from the environment. And these are the services that humans get, the benefits that humans get from nature. We actually tried to quantify that in dollar terms. A lot of environmentalists and ecologists were concerned about putting a dollar value, but it was somewhere in the $3 trillion. But that idea of ecosystem services has become a very central idea, even to the Sustainable Sites Initiative that Chris referred to that I'm going to come back to. The Millennial Ecosystem came out in 2005. There was a global study published that looked at what are the different services we get from nature, what is the status of those things, how do they contribute to well-being. So that idea of ecosystem services has become very prominent in how we talk about what humans get from nature. Recently, their business case, just this October, Swiss Re, which is an insurance company, came up with this publication on the business case for for addressing ecosystem services, the business case for addressing biodiversity loss. They actually broke the entire Earth down into square kilometers, and they looked at these different, you can kind of see on the right of the slide there, things like habitat intactness, water quality, pollinators, lumber, food production. They had these different ecosystem metrics, and then they mapped the globe. And their conclusion was that about 20% of the Earth's nations are at risk from ecological collapse tied to loss of biodiversity. And what I really liked about this analysis, I think on this map you can look at the western US and see that they're really at risk mostly due to the aridity and climate change. But I liked about this analysis, not only was it a business case for ecosystem services, it also linked biodiversity and ecosystem services together very strongly. And that's something we've had debates about. Do you have to have all the biodiversity there? Can you get the ecosystem service without it? I think we're coming around to realizing that biodiversity is inextricably linked to that. And so when we talk about building sustainable landscapes, it's certainly one of the real ecological keys that we have to think about. The other thing I think for us in Florida, which isn't true for everybody on the planet, is that we live in a biodiversity hotspot. And what that means is we live in a region that had historically, pre-settlement, a tremendous amount of native biodiversity, 1,500 plants minimum endemic to the region, plus a tremendous amount of animal diversity. And to be a hotspot, you not only have to have that, you also have to have more than 70% of the habitat gone. And in this case, our upland ecosystems where we do most of our building were longleaf pine ecosystems, and in that case, we have 3% left. We've destroyed 97% of what was a 90 million acre ecosystem across the southeastern US. If you were to think about losing 97% of the Amazon, people would be shocked. But that's essentially what we did in the southeastern United States when we converted our landscape away from the longleaf pine. So when we think about biodiversity, we have to think in terms of that regional context of where does that biodiversity come from of our region? How do we maintain that? We certainly don't maintain it in the center of a city like Orlando, but how do we maintain it in our entire landscape? So we live in a biodiversity hotspot. That's important because we have more biodiversity and threatened biodiversity than some other regions. The other thing I like about biodiversity, you can measure it. Now, you might have to have an ecologist on staff, but most environmental consulting firms would have somebody. They did to do wetland surveys. So we do have a lot of trained personnel in the world that actually spend some time and have that knowledge. Just the number of species, who's there. And then how many are there? What's the abundance of those things? These are things that we measure on a routine basis. And then diversity indices take into account what is the distribution of the different species. Are they evenly distributed? Is there one dominant species and some rare species? And finally, this other diversity index that people maybe don't think about, but it's very important. It's diversity at the landscape scale. I like to illustrate it just with UCF as a 1,400 acre campus. We have 11 to 12 documented Florida natural area inventory ecosystems on our campus. 11 to 12 different ecosystems in 1,400 acres. So that patchiness and distribution of different types of ecosystems is important. And with the overlay of a 600 acre developed area that has built landscapes that we've designed and built as well around the built campus. So biodiversity is measurable, and it happens at various scales as well. Here's an example, a study done in England where they looked at 4 different cities, and they looked at all these different habitat types, including builtscapes, allotments, community gardens, gardens around houses, residential areas, and then they looked at the distribution of pollinators in all those different habitats. And then they did a projection. If we increased this particular kind of habitat by that much, what would have the biggest impact on increasing pollinator diversity. It's kind of an interesting study, but that shows you can define all these different patches and all these different places in the urban environment. And you can look at them. You could look at them from the perspective of pollinators. You could look at them from the perspective of birds. You could look at them from the perspective of species diversity. And in urban ecology, which is an emerging field that's been around for about 20 years, they've done this for a lot of cities around the world. And in some cases, you find that there's more diversity in an urban area because of the introduction of horticultural varieties. And in some cases, some species, animal species of conservation concerns sometimes do better in urban environments. So it's not always a really clear-cut case. So this is the kind of thing to consider when we're talking about more urban areas. Frederick Steiner was actually a landscape architect who's been very involved in the Sites Initiative that Chris talked about earlier. Here's his vision that he had in a recent paper that he published. Any landscape holds the possibility to both improve and regenerate the natural benefits and services of ecosystems. So really, any landscape, no matter where you are in any community, if you've got landscape, you have the possibility to improve and regenerate the natural benefits and services. And at the Arboretum, we have a vision that's kind of like that, but we think that all people should be able to learn about, benefit from, and connect with nature. That's kind of an underlying principle to include that social aspect. People should have access to these things. So Chris referred to this, I won't go into it in depth, but the Sustainable Sites Initiative was developed as an outside certification and then was absorbed into LEED. So LEED, the Green Building Council, now runs that. It is a hard initiative. Chris is more familiar than I am, but it's quite difficult to hit the target. Some people, like the New York City Parks, have adopted it, and it's certainly, if you want to be certified, there is a certification tool, and this is one of many that's out there. This is nice because it fits into the LEED certification, which a lot of people use already. The 5 principles that I've got here are kind of reiterating what Chris said, but we need to meet the aesthetic, environmental, and socioeconomic goals. The aesthetic ones are important, as well as the socioeconomic. In general, I think reducing the inputs. We have a lot of high input ecosystems that aren't even performing very well from an ecological standpoint, and sometimes reducing those can really contribute to more sustainability. And not just water, but also fertilizers and pesticides and those kinds of things. And then increasing the diversity. I like to say to people, for a lot of people, I could go to your yard and say, I can increase your biodiversity by 10 times. 10 times, not incrementally a little bit, because there's so many urban, suburban landscapes that have virtually no something like a pollinator habitat or bad or insufficient bird habitat. You can really make big jumps with little steps in some of these places. So increasing biological diversity is a challenge. You can't do the same thing everywhere, but it's a good goal. And then this climate resilience is very important. I was at UC Davis last year. They've got a whole issue with their climate resilience of the oak trees they are known for are just not going to grow there in 30 years. They have to completely envision what are we going to be living in with this climate change situation. And in here, I think we need to think about, I'm going to live in 10A, which is our climate zone. We're currently in 9B. I'm planning for 10A because I'm pretty confident in 30 years we're going to have a more subtropical climate here. And it's going to be harder to grow those things that are at the southern end of their range here. So that's something I think we need to consider. I showed this slide. The main thing I want to show on this slide is natural ecosystem has cycle of growth and decay. Decay actually is one of the biggest parts of an ecosystem. Most of the energy flows through the detritus in the soil, not through the plants or from the plants into the soil. You have very complex, resilient systems that have a lot of redundancy, and you have all those little connections you see in that diagram I've shown. Sunlight, air, water, and soil, and you get the outputs of the natural ecosystem. And in the built environment, what we do is, number one, we decouple that growth and decay, because in most cases we're trimming and then putting the trimmings in the garbage can, and then the trimmings go to the landfill. So we're breaking that up. We're also adding fertilizer and pesticide and things like that in general. And you break down the number of connections, and that basically takes out some of the resilience out of the system. That's why somebody who really pumps up their St. Augustine grass is at the great risk of losing their St. Augustine grass versus somebody who has a lower input and more diverse system, because you're kind of dependent on a system that has broken down those connections that make it more resilient, if that makes sense. So I think it's very important that we think about the difference between developed and native landscapes, that they're always going to be different, We're never going to get a natural system, built in the center of a major city. Maybe we could, but we do need to think about targets and what we're shooting for and how we can increase the resilience of landscapes. And here's another one, just referring to habitat complexity. And this one focuses on ecosystem services of things like microclimate regulation, air purification, but I think it would also apply to something like birds. If you have the typical lawn, suburban ecosystem, which is turf and trees, with maybe a few shrubs. That's not a very complex habitat if you're a bird. If you have a sub-canopy layer of some wonderful native shrubs that you can easily add to a landscape that's very low maintenance, you can create a habitat very simply in any place that actually takes advantage of this habitat complexity. So complexity is a very important thing, and I'm always thinking about, well, how are you going to get this digestible for people? So there are ways to do it that's very digestible and very easy. And then there's ways you might go deeper if you're willing to make a bigger commitment on maintenance and knowledge base. There's ways you can do it across the entire spectrum. But complexity is important. I'm going to show you some case studies kind of quickly here, but from UCF, we talk about sustainable horticulture. That goes about everything along the lines that Chris was talking about, Florida friendly and that sort of a thing. You need plant material that is durable. If you're managing a landscape, you're not only planting it, you then have the maintenance, or you're paying someone to maintain it. The easier it is to maintain, the more familiar the maintenance team is with the material, the easier and cheaper that's going to be. And they're just wonderful horticulture varieties. In Florida, I am a very strong advocate of increasing natives. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But these landscapes were designed a lot for aesthetics, but also because, hey, let's put a plant there that's beautiful, that has color to it, that is going to last for years. It's going to be one-up-time investment, and when people walk by it, like the one up in the upper left-hand corner, that was basically a landscape designed by the landscape superintendents and the land manager coming up with their favorite plant, and I put them all together for them. And none of them are native. They're all going to be beautiful, and it's going to last for years. We started out with Dune sunflower, which is a native, which failed multiple times, which was always weedy, and never gave that wow factor. So there is aesthetics is important, and we cannot abandon the incredible horticultural palette from around the world that we can use here in Florida. And some of those provide excellent services like pollinator services. Some of them are perfectly good for native species. In the lower left, we have 2 natives and 2 introduced species together. Schefflera and cordyline are boring plants to everybody, but they work very well, and we know how to use them. And then we have Kuntis in the front, and we have the Protus palm in the back. So very often mixing together natives and traditional horticultural material is an excellent way to introduce people to natives. Is sneak them in there, you can use them, and the ones that work really well are great. And then we've got another example there. It says none of those are natives, but they're all great, reliable, long-term, low-input plants that are performing beautifully in that context. Then we have natives. Of course, saw palmetto on the left. I think if you're a landscape architect in Florida, you use it, you know what its value. The only people I know who don't like saw palmetto, they tend not to be from Florida. They come from somewhere else. But we have that sustainable plant that's really has got a lot of good use to it. Then in the middle there, we're using porterweed, which is a native plant. We're actually using it. That's the first time we've used that plant in a landscape bed. There's some controversy over how native this variety might be, but again, we're trying to use it on this landscape relevant scale. And then on the right, we've really tried to use these other natives, which are a little bit challenging. And Chris brought up the point of maintenance. Learning how to maintain some of these native species is challenging. We're a testing ground, and you really have to make them usable for people. So there are some maintenance issues we have to work on. At UCF, we also do a lot with pollinator conservation. We were the first Bee Campus USA in Florida. We do have pollinator gardens, which are very labor intensive, by the way, if you want to do them well and keep them going. And then we also support pollinator research and conservation. We're lucky at UCF to have fantastic conservation lands as well, of high value conservation lands. And we introduced a prescribed fire program right on campus in the middle of a residential urban kind of wild urban interface, and have just had tremendous responses in the biodiversity of those systems, where you can go out there now and you are basically walking through what might have been considered a native Florida system right there on campus. Just tremendous response in the biodiversity. Doing this in an urban landscape is challenging. We have that expertise and trying to get more of that done in some of these edges of the city environments. Birds are becoming an increasing conservation issue. 2 of the birds I've shown here have food in their mouth, and you will see that one has a caterpillar. And I want to emphasize there that the native species of plant produce more caterpillars because the moths and butterflies have evolved here for hundreds of thousands of years. They're adapted to the plants. When you plant a plant from Asia, you're not going to have as many caterpillars on it. They're not adapted to it. So that actually has uphill effects on the food web because the birds need the caterpillars. So native plants have multiple benefits, one of which is they are better food web support, not just for pollinators, but for things up the food chain. A couple other case studies, I'll go real quick here from UCF. On the right side, we've got traditional stormwater ponds, but we've let the littoral zone develop. We have a fully developed littoral zone. We didn't plant it, it just became what it is. It supports 10 times, 100 times more biodiversity than just a bare stormwater pond edge. So these little things can have a big impact. And then on the right side, we've done some stream, and Chris talked about our stream restoration and some wetland restoration as well. So there is ecological restoration you can do in an urban context and a developed context. Chris talked about transects. On the right side, I have downtown Orlando. You can see you have patches. You have some upscale residential that have more green space. You have more impoverished urban areas. They have lower quality green space. And then out in UCF, we're at the urban wild interface. And that urban wild interface where the city is going into the wild areas is an extremely important sector for conservation. And I think most of us are probably aware of some of those issues that are facing Central Florida. Barriers to sustainable landscapes. Chris talked about the social norms. We have development constraints. Developer has to have something that's easy and cost efficient. The codes and ordinances are complex, and it's a great tool, but they're also kind of militate against sustainable landscapes in some cases. We have some design limitations and also the horticultural limitations in terms of the availability of plant material and how do we manage it. And Florida has more HOAs than any other state, and they cover a lot of ground. And so an HOA ordinance has a huge impact on the biodiversity in the state of Florida, FYI. So immediate solutions, developing and promoting horticultural varieties that are native, I think is important. Developing guidelines and templates for designers. I also think that designers need to be educated better when they're being trained as designers on these ecological underpinnings so that they can incorporate them better into their training and into their designs. Turfgrass is a big issue, and if it's mixed turfgrass, it could be a very good habitat. If it is highly monocultural design, it really is not very supportive of biodiversity. So reducing turfgrass and managing it differently. There are certifications, and the more communities, I'm excited to hear about communities, and I want to hear about more that are trying to seek some kind of sustainable certification, because I think that's the direction we need to go. We also need to retrofit existing communities, and that may be a challenge. And then really a more regional approach. I know the counties of Orlando, and of Orange County and Seminole County, for example, are really struggling now with some of their conservation lands. There's some controversies that have occurred over the past couple of years, and the conservation land they have to manage it. And in all cases, in many cases, it's not being managed to its full potential because of some of these challenges with prescribed fire and not having the staff and the budgets to do it. So we really have to think holistically at a very broad scale about how we're going to achieve good conservation, preservation within this built and urban environment. So with that, that's the last slide that I had. And Chris and I are now going to hopefully have a conversation about some of the issues that we raised this morning.
Wow, that was that's actually, to me, I think you just threw out a gauntlet, a challenge, especially around, the whole idea. Okay, wait. So, I'm going to back up. So, like, as we were talking earlier, I started out my studies in forestry. And then when I went to the University of Georgia, there was a guy named Daryl Morrison. And his big focus and teaching emphasis was on ecology in the landscape and kind of challenging us as designers to incorporate those ecologies into our designs. And so throughout the course of a career, trying to actually implement that and also make it aesthetically pleasing to the common viewer or the common user is can be challenging. And so all of these things around creating sustainable landscapes there's a lot of pieces and parts.
Yes, there are. And Chris, we walked also, when you visited, we walked the Neptune housing, which was a big housing project at the University of Florida, Central Florida, where you did use mostly a native palette.
Yep.
And we walked it, and it's doing really well. It's easy to maintain. And so that's a great example of what can be done. But I think, knowing your customer is important too.
Right.
And you know that more than I do, because my customer is kind of the public, the students, the visitors, your customers, the paying customer. I guess they're all paying in a way. Is that, the depth of changes that need to take place. But then you see examples of, and it's not just working with you, we've worked with AECOM, other major designers that have really tried to, over the years, incorporate the nativeness part of it. And that's something I've really seen landscape architects embrace in Florida maybe over the past 15 years,
Yes.
10 to 15 years. Some of those have failed.
Yes.
And we've failed too. We have failed at some of those exercises too, but to me, if you don't make those efforts and go through those failures, you don't make it to the next step. But it seems to me maybe just with people's overall environmental awareness and ecological awareness, maybe you can speak to this. The fact that we're having the conversation, we have the collaborative, do you see change kind of happening in the industry beyond a landscape architect who cares about that, or a biologist who cares about this, just across the,
Right.
and are we, what are the major levers that need to be pulled to change that, if not?
Yeah, a lot of times, like if we're working for different sorts of different entities, if we're working for a development entity, their interest is in a beautiful landscape, a manageable landscape, one that elevates the value of the community. But quite frankly, they're often very open to innovation, and especially innovation that might problem solve. That's why we've been talking about this true landscape transect idea of, on a broad scale of, you showed it in a slide, and I thought it was really telling, kind of the oasis idea. Let's use ornamentals comfortably in those touch points and in those moments. And then let's transition to a mixed palette as you move away from that.
Yes.
And then as you move towards the edges, like you have on your college campus, it gets much more native, and then you have the conservation. I'm finding that there's definitely an acceptance and a desire to move in that direction. And aesthetically, I think folks are getting a little more used to that native-y look.
Yes. Yeah. There have been some, some
it's
folks,
interesting.
the folks who are working that in England, some scholars in that field, people in general, if it's a really wild type landscape, they can actually, this is examples from around the world actually, from Detroit to England, where it scares people because it looks unkempt.
Yes.
And if it's unkempt, that means no one's showing care. And if they're not showing care, then something else might go wrong here. So there is, a fear in that regard. But then there's other countries like the Netherlands who have so little left that they embrace the wild meadow that they planted in their cities, because they've reached that point. You can imagine the Netherlands, one of the most developed, highly densely populated. They've now reached the point where they recognize that if we don't do that, we're going to have nothing left. We hope we don't get to that point. But that's why I think having,
really
I don't want to say templates or little cookie cutter things, but introducing, and we talked about and have worked on this with Tim, and it just hasn't kind of rolled out yet, of coming up with our top 40. It ends up being 60. What are kind of those bulletproof native plants that anybody could use? Incorporate many of them into any landscape, provided proper location and following all the proper guidelines. Those are the things, to me, you're going to get in the nursery industry the quickest. The people who might want to grow them on a broader scale.
What's interesting, though, go back to the ecological communities, and you mentioned 11 ecological communities across UCF. So in the analysis stage, if you can identify the ecological community that might be appropriate to that particular landscape, and then have the bulletproof plants that can be applied to that ecological community specifically, of the 26 throughout the state of Florida. How cool would that be?
Yeah.
Right? And that maybe there's like the bulletproof list, but then these are the ones that we want to experiment with list. That would be an amazing list.
And I do think you brought it up, I brought it up too, but I think we, on the stormwater side, we can make a lot of progress. I had a student work on a project where she compared different urban stormwater ponds, and a lot of the residential, a lot of the highway ponds, they get out there, they spray herbicide, they mow up to the edge, and it's an ecologically deprived, diminished system that could very easily be changed by allowing some littoral zone to develop. Now, for us, it takes active management, but they're going and spraying herbicide 4 times a year. We have a company that comes once a month, checks the pond. They try to spray the exotics, but they let the natural community develop, which helps the little baby fish and all the bugs that live in the pond. So that's a great one too. And then the natural areas, you build these communities with the conservation area. I have in my neighborhood, there's a conservation area. It's like, okay, nobody's doing anything in it. So over time, the risk of it getting invasive species like Brazilian pepper or one of the nasty Asian vines only increases through time. And very often we set aside these conservation areas in like residential developments, but then we have no plan.
There's no management
for managing them. I think more communities are starting to realize that. And it is a challenge, I think, to think about how you would, what you're going to do about that. Because right now there's nobody who's responsible for managing those.
Yeah, interestingly enough, back to the stormwater pond, I know folks are going to hear from Pierce a little later, Pierce Jones. We're actually looking at an FDOT square pond on a project of ours, and we're hoping to approach FDOT about this pond to come up with a sustainable landscape strategy for the pond. Yes. Potentially some reshaping, potentially some littoral shelves. Let's change the paradigm broadly across all of these ponds that we have, and how amazing would that be?
Yeah.
Would that be around biodiversity? Oh yeah. There tends to be a fear that, if your pond becomes beautiful and natural, that if FDOT needs to change it, it becomes, regulated. So there's some regulatory
if they
concerns.
Fill in. People are concerned they're going to fill in, which happens anyway.
Naturally
they are cleaned out depending on the pond. But
it's interesting. So just answering some of those questions.
Yeah, and that's all getting to the scale issue. When my student did her project, just the Econ River watershed, which is where UCF is in the Little Econ watershed, there are 1,500 stormwater ponds. There's more stormwater ponds than if you fly into Orlando, look at all the lakes down there. There are more stormwater ponds than lakes, and more area coverage than lakes. And a lot of the wetlands are gone, or wetlands might remain, but you've created, it's like an artificial system that could have a lot of ecological integrity and resilience to it that we need to take advantage of because of its scale. It's
right. It would be amazing.
Yeah, in these lower lying areas where you've got the...
And I even think of like systems like, our turnpike system.
Yes.
Or FDOT corridors.
Yes.
How could we leverage those large-scale systems towards ecological diversity, so you're not out there like mowing miles and miles of landscapes?
There's some fantastic examples of that. I'm sure you've seen on I-10 in northern Florida, where they've really they have the pine woods, and they've just done some beautiful median plantings, and that's very doable. And even some of the cities, some of the roadside verges have weedy kind of species that can support dozens, if not hundreds, of species of pollinators and other things. That having a mowing schedule that maybe lets those get a little wild and then mow them, you could do that intentionally, where it's like we're letting that go this month because we want those flowers to be there and supporting all that, instead of getting into having to mow more frequently. And these are areas that are not irrigated anyway or anything like that. So there's the wild edges in urban areas can be very important too.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, fortunately, there are the metrics out there, and I think both of us talked about the Sustainable Sites Initiative as a potential benchmark. And it does work to address. And I was looking back through the kind of the general checklist. I was thinking about it, and it actually addresses a lot of the things we're talking about. Pollination and habitat. You talked about waste, which is actually how things decompose in the landscape. That's just one aspect of it.
Exactly. Just for us, the native grasses we trim once a year generally. So I was working with the landscape manager. He had to overcome this notion that, well, how about we just cut it low and place it around
and leave it
instead of removing it and buying mulch and bringing mulch in that we're going to spray with herbicide. So bringing people around that, when you cut a grass, you've got the mulch in your hand, and those are the kinds of resource efficiency things we need to take advantage of too.
I know a question I had for you on an overall landscape management standpoint. Do you guys compost?
No, of course the students always want us to, but some universities do. You got to kind of make a commitment to compost.
Yes.
And we generate a tremendous amount of food compost waste. We do make mulch. So, for example, if we cut down an oak tree, we make hardwood mulch out of it. Yes.
Interesting. Yeah, because I was thinking
we do that. Compost is a bigger commitment. Yeah.
It would be. But there's a lot of conversations out there about preparation of soil, using compost to establish the framework and minimize fertilization and that sort of thing. Because a lot of times in Florida landscapes, our native soils aren't necessarily that rich in nutrients. So establishing that nutrient base. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, there's another thing I wanted to bring up with you because. We do talk about, we have the 13 different kinds of ecosystems. Let's look what's there, and then but in urban systems, generally, especially with modern construction techniques, we bring in the soil.
Right.
We bring it in, and very often it is different from what would have been there. I'm in a sandy flatwoods, and I've got this rich organic topsoil there. So we don't always have the topsoil. The conditions aren't always right. And I think in that urban context, and in some contexts where people want them more lush, we could definitely take advantage of more organics as well. I think there's a whole realm of meeting nutritional needs in a way that's more beneficial, that doesn't require as much of the inorganic fertilizer input, which really, if you look at a lawn or a landscape, one of the biggest greenhouse gas emitters is the fertilizer. Because of the energy it takes to make it, transport it, put it on. So that's one of the things I think we need to pull back on if we can. But that notion of soils is very important, and urban soils are very often not good. They've got construction, especially in urban environments, you've got the construction rubble, so it's high pH. We've been very good, for example, being very strict, and Orlando might be strict too, where we have actually for some construction projects that you need to remove a foot of topsoil because this was a parking lot or whatever, and they have to replace that foot of topsoil because you want those plants to be in a good context. And that's maybe something in an urban system that's a little different, because we really construct the soil as much as we do the buildings in some senses, in that we bring it in very often. So yeah, that's an interesting part of the whole thing. One of the things they have for Florida friendly is the use of mulch too, and I think we tend to over mulch. And what happens to a lot of managers is things die, they mulch it, and then they spray herbicide on the mulch bed. And a lot of the insects really need bare soil. They need sand. A lot of the native bees need sand. So in that context, people could probably cut back on mulch, and they're making better habitat for the bee. Isn't just pollinating your flower, it's building a hole in the ground only where there's open sand. So even those little things for designers to think about, and then for managers to think about, because it makes them very uncomfortable to see sand if you're a landscape maintenance person. And I don't know if part of that is because we talk about use mulch well in the Florida friendly, or people aren't as aware. We've certainly moved away. I think it was more common in the past to overmulch, where people would build mulch up around the trees. So mulching judiciously is very important for that soil health as well, because you can choke a plant out with too much of it.
Yeah, I kind of go back to this idea of the transect, that perhaps your ornamental, perfect-looking, landscape is at those touch points.
Yes.
And then as you think about, your management and maintenance practices, you go a little more natural as you move out.
Yeah, that's a great. Yeah, I think you came up with the oasis term. Because what was that zone? Oh, the oasis zone. It's not so much an oasis zone, but it kind of is, because it's an attention grabber. And I just kind of made fun of, because we have a research park near us. A lot of industrial parks, they plant the marigolds at the sign, or they plant the the other little zinnias that you get at the nursery. And I don't want to be too critical of that, but the things that you could do in Florida with color, with crotons and bromeliads, and that you plant once and then maintain, and actually have a more striking. So that's that touch point you're talking about.
Right.
That's where you need to incorporate those horticultural materials. So we have had a lot of fun with that. But we know on the back end of it, the matrix has to have more of that native structure.
Right, it does.
And just driving up here in Winter Park today, coming up Park Avenue, coming to the golf course, I found one beautiful, looks like a sable miner out front here. But I just thought, boy, you could have a lot more native than you have without people even noticing it.
They wouldn't even notice that it's in the fabric.
Yeah, so
that's interesting.
There's a lot of potential out there. So the more people become aware, I think the more availability comes in the nurseries and when it's embraced, and the more the developers and people who plan can incorporate these things. I think that's a good place to start.
Right, right. And even the maintenance and the maintenance and management of natives and how that can be done successfully. One of the things I noted in as you were talking was the heavy maintenance required around a pollinator.
Depending on how you design it or what your goals are, yeah.
Right, and that's often a desire, for folks, is to have a pollinator garden or to have that moment. But then, can it from an aesthetic standpoint, can it be beautiful? I mean, can it, like the ideal would be, in Florida, could our pollinator garden actually look like an English perennial garden?
It could. I mean,
Could it?
it may be a little bit because we use things like the salvias and the pentas and things like that. But getting to your scale issue, to have a pollinator garden kind of has a theme to it where you have to have 5 different types of plant families to support right in your garden, or you step back from the landscape and say, well, I've got some porterweed over there that the bumblebees are using, and I've got something over here that maybe the natives like more, and I've got trees that maybe provide some pollinator services. So pollinator garden in itself is a more challenging thing, but pollinator plants like firebush or something like that, those are easy to incorporate.
Right, broadly.
For those who want to have that service, a pollinator service, but not the either messiness or intense management of a pollinator garden or meadow. Because most of them require some, even IFAS, the University of Florida, down on the center down on Conway, the Extension Center, they have a beautiful meadow, but they spend a lot of time getting torpedo grass out of there. It does take maintenance to keep it that beautiful meadow. If you let it go and came back in 3 years, people might not like what they see.
Yeah.
So it kind of depends on what your commitment is, what your goal is, if it's education, if it's demonstration, if it's my backyard and I'm willing to put that effort into it, versus, there's some really good pollinator plants that we can plant that don't require a lot of maintenance. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, so I know we just have a little bit of time left, and as we think about closing the session, I was wondering if are there any kind of final points that you think we need to drive home, or that we want to leave everyone with, and kind of challenge everyone that's out there?
I think the real challenge now is we've started the conversation. Let's keep the collaborative moving forward, and keep this conversation moving, and making sure that the right people are continuing to work together on this. I think that's, from the collaborative perspective, I think that is important. So I'm certainly hoping that we see that continues into the future.
Right.
How about you?
Yeah, I'm wondering if perhaps we do work on, establishing, if it needs to be a Florida metric, take Florida friendly and call it Florida friendly plus, or look to something like the Site Sustainability Initiative as that benchmark. I think that we have all the tools out there to do it. How do we kind of challenge the landscape industry, the land development world, to moving towards a more overarching sustainable approach to land design and landscape sustainability.
Well, I do hope we get some insight on that in this afternoon's session.
Yeah, I do too.
There's more to follow.
I do too.
So
it'll be pretty neat.
Yeah.
And then finally, we just want to thank everyone for attending the session. Patrick and I have, it's been nice collaborating on this conversation. It's provided the opportunity for entities to already start connecting and having the conversations around a holistic and sustainable approach to landscape implementation and management. And we just want to, I think we'd just like to see it continue to move forward. Any final?
Well, thank you for coming, and we stay part of the conversation. Everyone has something to contribute.
Yep.
Thank you.
So, thank you very, very much. We really appreciate your time.